Hello, my friends. Start with Reuters. Reuters ran a report yesterday citing sources, and Reuters is often treated as a gold standard for people familiar with the matter, that the Trump administration was going to strike Iran and that it was supposed to happen yesterday evening. The setup looked ominous. Talk of U.S. personnel ordered to evacuate nearby bases, the airspace around Iran tightening, then shutting down in anticipation. And then, nothing. No U.S. attack. What matters is not simply that no strike occurred, but that the White House was forced to manage expectations after the media had already preloaded the narrative. President Trump was asked directly about striking Iran, and his tone softened. He said something to the effect of, "We've been told the killing in Iran is stopping. It's stopped, it's stopping. There's no plan for executions." That statement is doing multiple jobs at once. It signals restraint, it creates a humanitarian off-ramp, and it frames any pause in action as conditional dependent on Iranian behavior rather than a U.S. inability or unwillingness. And that takes us to the Iranian internal picture. It has been widely acknowledged, not completely, but substantially, that Iran has gotten on top of the protests. Not perfectly, not without friction, but enough to regain a grip. The fact that the airspace over Iran, which was shut down yesterday amid strike speculation, was opened up today reinforces the sense that immediate crisis escalation has been deferred. In the same breath, we have the executions issue. There were supposed to be executions, but it looks like Iranian authorities decided not to move forward. From a moral standpoint, executions are always a flashpoint that's obvious. But strategically, the decision not to proceed is even more important. If Iran had pressed forward with executions at this moment, it could have gifted President Trump or the advisors pushing for an attack the pretext they were looking for. Humanitarian intervention, deterrence, punishment, pick your label. By holding off, Tehran reduces the propaganda fuel and de-escalates internally. It also narrows Washington's menu of clean justifications. Now notice how the media baton gets passed. Reuters talks strike, it doesn't happen. Trump softens. Iran pauses executions. The protests are described as coming under control. So what comes next? The Wall Street Journal runs a piece saying, essentially, hold on, the attack is still coming, and it will come via Tomahawk missiles. That's the pattern, keep the possibility alive even when the moment passes. And then NBC adds another layer. NBC reports that the strike was called off not because Washington suddenly found religion, but because Trump wants a quick knockout, a decisive blow that devastates Iran, collapses the leadership, and delivers regime change fast enough for him to claim victory without a long war. This is critical, because it is an admission, even if only by implication, of what the whole approach is really about. NBC's framing is that Trump told his advisors he wanted a plan that would devastate Iran, devastate the leadership, and trigger rapid collapse, but the advisors could not guarantee the outcome, so the action was called off. In that telling, the issue wasn't morality, legality, or proportionality. The issue was certainty of payoff. Trump wants a swift, decisive action, not a long, grinding campaign that leads to U.S. boots on the ground. He wants to avoid that at all costs. And this is where you have to understand how this administration conceptualizes force. It's not the classic neocon template of the Bush-era Rumsfeld, McCain, and that entire mentality that tolerates years of occupation, open-ended operations, and the slow bleed of a permanent war state. Trump doesn't want 10 rounds. He wants a first or second round knockout. That means deception, misdirection, intelligence services in the mix, and the kind of decapitation strike logic that imagines you can remove the head and the body collapses. We've seen this preference elsewhere in the way operations are described. Capturing Nicolas Maduro as negotiations unfold somewhere else. Talk of quick regime change solutions, drone strikes and covert action as pressure tools, and the insistence on outcomes that can be branded as immediate wins. That is the lesson for Iran and, frankly, for any country Trump may target. He does not want a long conflict. He wants a quick knockout. Even the first conflict framing with Iran reflects this, the way it's described. It was roughly 12 days, and then the U.S. side had to tap out. The emphasis here is not the exact day count, it's the operational principle. Go for decapitation, go for regime change, and if it doesn't land quickly, step back rather than commit to a prolonged war. And that brings us to what is now increasingly admitted. The justification carousel uranium missiles democracy protesters is marketing. The underlying objective, as it's being openly discussed, is regime change. When even mainstream outlets are effectively normalizing that as the core aim, you're no longer talking about preventive defense. You're talking about political transformation by force. In this context, the Washington Post report is particularly interesting. The Post claims Russia mediated messages between Israel and Iran, with both sides reassuring each other via a Russian intermediary that neither would strike first. The headline logic is, with tensions high, Israel and Iran secretly reassured each other through Russia that they would not preemptively attack. If that's accurate, it tells you something important about the shadow structure of influence in the region. Moscow is positioned as a channel that can talk to actors who publicly treat each other as existential enemies. That alone should make Western policymakers nervous, because it suggests Russia has leverage and credibility where Washington increasingly relies on threats and pressure campaigns. From Iran, shift gears to Project Ukraine, because the rhetorical pivot from Trump is just as revealing there. Reuters reports Trump saying that most of the blame for the lack of a settlement lies not with Putin but with Zelensky. Ukraine is less ready to make a deal. The way it's framed is almost personal. Trump says he doesn't like Zelensky, that Zelensky is holding things up. If you've watched the oscillation pattern, this fits perfectly. After any episode that damages Washington's posture with Moscow, such as the fallout around alleged drone strikes near sensitive Russian locations tied to Putin, Trump then tries to sweet-talk Russia back into a workable channel. And we're hearing that channel building is happening again. Reports indicate that Steve Witkoff and Jared Kushner are trying to get to Moscow. Lavrov suggests meetings are likely. Putin may see them. That means Trump has every incentive to soften toward Russia publicly and shift blame onto Zelensky to repair standing with Putin before a potential envoy visit. But the flip side is predictable. The moment Witkoff and Kushner sit with Putin for 5 or 6 hours and present a peace plan, whether 20 points or 200, Trump can just as easily pivot back to, I'm disappointed with Putin. That's the whiplash cycle. Praise, blame shift, courtship, then disappointment when reality doesn't bend to a headline-friendly outcome. While that theater plays out, look at what the United States is doing in parallel. Fox News reports the U.S. freezing visa processing for 75 countries, including Somalia, Russia, and Iran. Note the psychological packaging. Russia sandwiched between Somalia and Iran, the rhetorical Axis vibe plus 72 others. Regardless of whether this is bureaucratic, political, or security-driven, the signal is unmistakable. Even as Trump talks about deals, the machinery of pressure continues. Inside Ukraine, the domestic political stress is also intensifying. There's another NABU, National Anti-Corruption Bureau of Ukraine investigation, and it appears to target one of Zelensky's principal rivals, Yulia Tymoshenko, the gas princess, as she's often labeled, partly due to her historical association with energy, wealth, and influence, and partly because the mythos around her has always been entwined with gas politics. Reports describe allegations that her party paid members of parliament, including members from Zelensky's own Servant of the People party, to vote favorably on certain agendas. Bribes for votes. Whether the claims stick or not, the political effect is clear. Pressure a rival, fracture opposition, and keep domestic control as the war grinds on and energy infrastructure collapses under Russian strikes. And that energy collapse is driving emergency governance. We're told the Zelensky administration is pushing emergency orders or legislation to conserve energy because of blackouts, because Russia continues to smash Ukraine's energy infrastructure. That's not a side detail, that's the backbone of state capacity. You can't run industry, logistics, and basic governance on rolling blackouts forever without political consequences. Now look at Europe. None of this stops the European Union from pushing ahead with a massive €90 billion support loan to Ukraine. Ursula von der Leyen is described as pressing forward, with the structure 2/3 to weapons, 1/3 to plugging Ukraine's budget hole over the next year or two. And then comes the intra-EU fight. From whom do they buy the weapons, European military-industrial firms or US firms? That argument is not moral. It's industrial and strategic. It's about who captures the money flow and who builds the dependency. The most striking claim here is the repayment logic. The loan allegedly doesn't require Ukraine to pay it back unless Russia loses and is forced to pay reparations, in which case Ukraine must repay. If Russia wins, Ukraine can't repay. So Europe is setting itself up for a scenario where, if Ukraine fails, EU member states are stuck paying interest reportedly about $3 billion per year on a loan that Ukraine can't service. And then the solution emerges: Russian frozen assets. Roughly €140 billion immobilized in the EU becomes the tempting pool. The plan, as described, is that if Ukraine can't repay, the EU will attempt to seize or tap Russian frozen reserves to cover the loan. This is presented with the language of legality in full accordance with EU and international law. But the obvious question is, what international law exactly permits simply converting immobilized sovereign assets into your own debt repayment mechanism because your proxy project failed? This is where the discussion becomes blunt. The moral and legal order is being redefined by power. If the claim is that international law can be stretched to justify this, then you're admitting that the real rule is expediency, and that, effectively, law becomes whatever the dominant coalition says it is at the moment. If that is now the operating standard, then other countries watching this, not just Russia, will draw conclusions about what it means to keep reserves in Western jurisdictions. Add another layer from your active. In a closed-door meeting, von der Leyen reportedly said her mission is to build a very powerful EU military to turn Europe from an economic power into a military powerhouse. We're told, a security strategy this year, a military powerhouse next year. The irony writes itself. Europe is presented as not in tatters, not deindustrialized, while simultaneously talking about a massive militarization drive. The sarcasm practically demands itself. If you believe that, maybe you should also invest in whatever the EU plans to buy in bulk to make this miracle happen: the industrial inputs, the logistics, the mundane material backbone of war making. Because military power is not speeches, it's production capacity. From Europe, shift north to Greenland, because this is where the internal contradictions of allies are being exposed in public. Denmark signed a bilateral security agreement on the 23rd of February 2024 with Ukraine. The punchline, and it's not really funny, is that if Denmark or Greenland is threatened, Ukraine would theoretically be obligated to defend Denmark under that agreement. So if the United States threatens Greenland, the absurd logic becomes Ukraine is now on the hook to defend Denmark against the US. It's a perfect illustration of how these paper guarantees multiply until they become strategic nonsense. Now, according to reporting and statements, there was a high-level meeting involving U.S. leadership, Vice President J.D. Vance and Secretary of State Marco Rubio and Denmark's foreign minister, along with representation tied to Greenland. The meeting did not resolve the core dispute. Washington wants Greenland. Denmark and Greenland are begging Washington not to take it. Denmark's Foreign Minister Lars Løkke Rasmussen reportedly described the conversation as frank and constructive, but acknowledged they did not change the U.S. position. He said, "It's clear the president has this wish of conquering Greenland, and Denmark made clear it's not in the kingdom's interest." That is an extraordinary thing to hear inside what is supposedly the world's most disciplined alliance structure. One for all for one, is the slogan, but slogans don't survive when a major power decides it wants a strategic asset and is willing to coerce an ally for it. Then comes the escalation theater on the European side, reports of token troop deployments, numbers so small they border on satire, a handful of soldiers here and there, maybe totaling around 15 at the time of the commentary. Germany joining European partners with a troop deployment to Greenland. France promising a few. Macron warning of unprecedented consequences if the US takes Greenland. And the obvious retort, even framed through mocking Russian commentary, is that Europe will not fight the United States for Greenland. The unprecedented consequences line is posture. If Washington moves, Europe folds. And everyone knows it. Trump's own messaging compounds the insult. On Truth Social, he posts a message aimed at NATO leadership, NATO Secretary General Mark Rutte, essentially telling Denmark to get them out of there. Then he mocks Denmark's ability to defend Greenland with 2 dog sleds, insisting only the US can protect it. And he links this to a Danish intelligence report warning about Russian and Chinese goals in the Arctic and toward Greenland. This is the key. Denmark's own Russia-China threat narrative becomes the pretext for Washington's pressure campaign. Denmark, in other words, wrote the script that Washington is now using against Denmark. The binary framing is also brutal. Greenland must choose between the shiny United States and the dark storm of China and Russia, as if Denmark itself is irrelevant. No third option. No sovereignty. Just a forced choice between Empire A and the specter of Empire B, C, even while China and Russia are framed as having no interest in Greenland in any concrete, immediate sense beyond long-term Arctic positioning narratives. Meanwhile, the Venezuela file gets pulled back into view. There's talk of Trump having a very good call with Delcy Rodriguez, described in this narrative as an interim leadership figure discussing oil, minerals, trade, and national security, with Trump claiming tremendous progress and promising a spectacular partnership in a soon-to-be prosperous Venezuela. There's also mention that Putin spoke with Brazil's Lula about Venezuela the same day, which indicates Venezuela is not a U.S. only chessboard. Then we get the side plot, Maria Corina Machado, labeled here as a Nobel Prize winner in the narrative, meeting Trump, with talk of her being willing to give up the Nobel Prize in exchange for political elevation, and the reminder that Nobel rules don't allow transferring a prize. Again, the through line is regime change bargaining in optics, prizes, legitimacy tokens, and political outcomes treated as tradable chips. Finally, in the clown world segment of reality, the part that reads like satire but lands, because it's plausible in our media environment. Politico reports EU chief diplomat Kaja Kallas, joking that global events mean it might be time to start drinking. The dark joke embedded in the commentary is, are we supposed to believe she's been saying everything she said for years sober? The point is less about her personally and more about the EU establishment's visible distress as the transatlantic relationship fractures over Greenland. When the alliance narrative breaks, the leadership class reaches for coping mechanisms or jokes about them because they have no coherent plan for a world where Washington treats allies as subordinates. And then, as if to underline the decline of dignity across the political spectacle, there's the story described as not closely followed but bookmarked about Trump allegedly giving the middle finger to a worker who also serves as a firefighter after someone shouted insulting words connected to the Epstein smear ecosystem. The aftermath becomes its own commentary on the economy of outrage. A GoFundMe is started, and it quickly raises over $350,000, perhaps more by now. In other words, a moment of presidential contempt becomes a fundraising engine. The politics becomes content. The content becomes cash. The cash becomes the only accountability mechanism anyone can measure. So when you zoom out, the day's picture is coherent, even if it's ugly. On Iran, the strike narrative is used as pressure, but the operation is constrained by the administration's demand for a fast, decisive win, a quick knockout rather than a prolonged conflict. Iran responds smartly by avoiding escalatory actions that would hand Washington pretexts, and Russia appears positioned as a quiet intermediary, preventing regional ignition. On Ukraine, Trump blames Zelensky to massage relations with Moscow ahead of potential envoy talks, while pressure tools like visa freezes continue. Inside Ukraine, anti-corruption mechanisms function as political weapons against rivals in a collapsing energy environment. In Europe, the EU writes massive checks, argues over who profits from weapons procurement, and prepares to socialize the costs potentially through the seizure of Russian assets, while simultaneously talking about transforming itself into a military powerhouse. And above it all, Greenland exposes the alliance reality. When Washington wants something, Allied sovereignty becomes negotiable, and Europe's threats become theater. That's where we are, a world where regime change logic is increasingly said out loud, where international law is invoked as a flexible slogan, where media cycles manufacture imminent war and then keep it alive even when it doesn't happen, and where the strongest players treat weaker partners as props. The danger is not just any single strike or any single loan. The danger is the normalization of a system in which coercion is routine, legality is retrofitted, and escalation is treated as a branding problem rather than a civilizational risk.